The war room aboard Admiral Vashi's flagship hummed with the kind of tension that made even seasoned military officers check their weapon safeties twice. Around the massive holographic display table, representatives from 12 different species sat in their various forms of natural and artificial protection. Admiral Vashi himself was a sight to behold, his 8 arms moving in perfect coordination as he gestured toward the tactical displays, his natural chitinous armor gleaming under the harsh overhead lights like polished obsidian. To his right sat General Kraftnog, whose molten core physiology meant his skin literally glowed with internal heat, natural lava rock formations providing him with armor that could withstand direct plasma strikes. The molten general never needed to worry about environmental suits or protective gear. After all, when your body temperature runs at roughly 2,000 degrees Celsius, most hostile environments become merely, well, mildly uncomfortable. The other council members were equally impressive in their natural defenses. Judge Quintara's insectoid carapace could deflect energy weapons like they were gentle raindrops. Commander Drahorn's crystalline skin structure made him practically immune to radiation. Moran's triple-layered hide had evolved on a world where acid rain was considered a light drizzle. And then there were the humans. Commander Tom Mali sat at the far end of the table, looking remarkably underwhelming in his simple uniform. No natural armor, no protective carapace, no internal heat source capable of melting titanium. Just skin, soft, pink, utterly fragile-looking skin that seemed about as durable as tissue paper in a thunderstorm. Next to him, Amy Kowalski had her feet propped up on the conference table, much to the horror of several more formal species representatives. She was human too, obviously given her complete lack of any visible defensive adaptations. What she did have was a coffee mug that read "World's Okayest Engineer" and an expression that suggested she found this entire meeting about as thrilling as watching paint dry in a vacuum. "So let me understand this correctly," Admiral Vashi was saying, his voice carrying that particular tone reserved for explaining obvious facts to particularly slow children. "Your species, having no natural armor, no protective hide, no environmental resistances whatsoever, chooses to go into combat wearing what, exactly?" Commander Mali straightened in his chair. "Standard-issue combat fatigues, basic equipment harnesses, tactical gear as needed for the mission." The room erupted in what could charitably be called laughter, though it sounded more like a collection of dying machinery having an argument with a bag of gravel. General Kraftnog's molten chuckle caused the temperature in the room to spike several degrees. "Basic equipment," Judge Quintara repeated, her mandibles clicking in amusement. "You mean to tell us that your soft, fragile little bodies go into combat zones with nothing more than fabric and hope?" "Oh, it gets better," Admiral Vashi added, pulling up human military footage on the holographic display. "Look at this combat recording from the Kepler defense. And watch closely, everyone." The footage showed human soldiers advancing across a battlefield under heavy plasma fire. No environmental suits, no heavy armor plating, no energy shields. Just humans in their simple uniforms, moving with what appeared to be either incredible bravery or spectacular stupidity. "They are not even wearing helmets in half these engagements," Moran observed, his 3 eyes blinking in rapid succession, which was his species' equivalent of a double take. "How do they survive atmospheric changes? Radiation exposure? Chemical attacks?" Quartermaster demanded, his elongated neck stretching forward in disbelief. Amy Kowalski took a long, deliberate sip of her coffee and set the mug down with a soft clink. The sound somehow managed to cut through all the alien chatter like a plasma cutter through butter. "You all done?" she asked, her voice carrying just enough boredom to make it clear she had better places to be. The room fell silent. 12 pairs of alien eyes, in various numbers and configurations, turned toward the small human female who had just asked a room full of galactic military commanders if they were done, like she was a teacher waiting for you kindergartners to stop giggling. Amy rolled up her sleeves with the casual efficiency of someone who had done this particular demonstration more times than she cared to count. Her forearms were a roadmap of scars, burns, and what appeared to be bite marks from creatures that definitely had not been friendly when they left those particular souvenirs. See this one? She pointed to a long, jagged scar running from her wrist to her elbow. Acid-spitting cave worm on Proxima Station. Took 3 hours to kill that thing, and it got me good before I managed to drop a thermal charge down its throat. She rotated her arm, revealing more battle damage. This burn pattern? Plasma rifle backfired during the Titan-Moon conflict. Kept fighting for 6 more hours with second-degree burns covering 30% of my torso. The aliens leaned forward despite themselves, like motorists unable to look away from a traffic accident. And this beauty, Amy continued, pointing to what looked suspiciously like teeth marks on her shoulder, courtesy of a Regellian battle beast that thought I looked tasty. I convinced it otherwise with a broken piece of hull plating and what my grandmother would have called poor life choices. General Kraftnog's internal temperature had cooled considerably as he stared at the human female's collection of injuries. "How are you still alive?" he asked, and for the first time since the meeting began, there was no laughter in his voice. Amy's grin could have powered a small space station. Funny story about that. She leaned back in her chair, coffee mug in hand, and looked around the room at all these heavily armored, naturally protected, evolutionarily advanced warriors who were staring at her like she was some kind of biological impossibility. "You want to know why we don't need your fancy metal suits?" she asked, taking another sip of coffee. "Why we don't hide behind energy shields and environmental protection?" The room was so quiet that the hum of the ship's life support system sounded like a roaring waterfall. Amy's smirk widened. "Stick around for the next planetary assault, and I'll show you exactly why soft, fragile little humans have managed to carve out their own piece of this galaxy." She raised her mug in a mock toast. "Should be educational for everyone involved." Admiral Vashi's 8 arms moved in what his species considered a gesture of formal challenge, though to human eyes it looked more like an octopus having a seizure in slow motion. "Very well, Engineer Kowalski. I propose we test this human confidence in actual combat conditions." The holographic display shifted, showing a planet that looked like someone had taken a perfectly nice world and decided to make it as unpleasant as possible. Mordax 7 rotated slowly in the projection, its surface a swirling mess of green clouds, violent storm systems, and what appeared to be large moving shapes that definitely were not geological formations. "Mordax 7, Admiral Vashi announced, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone about to prove a very expensive point. Atmospheric composition, 73% sulfuric compounds, constant acid precipitation, gravity twice galactic standard. Native fauna includes pack-hunting acid spitters, burrowing razor claws, and something the survey team called those horrible screaming things that dissolve metal." General Kraftnog leaned forward, his molten skin crackling with what might have been anticipation. "The perfect testing ground. My people require full environmental suits even with our natural heat resistance. Joint military exercise," Judge Quintera added, her mandibles clicking approvingly. "Each species brings a small team. We complete standard tactical objectives under combat conditions." Commander Mali looked like he was about to object, probably with something sensible about proper preparation and safety protocols, but Amy cut him off with a wave of her scarred hand. "Sounds delightful," she said, finishing her coffee. "When do we leave?" The planning session that followed was a masterclass in military overcomplication. Each species outlined their requirements: specialized atmospheric processors, heavy armor modifications, backup life support systems, emergency evacuation protocols, and enough medical equipment to stock a small hospital. The Zentaurians needed pressure suits to protect their delicate gill slits. The insectoids required temperature regulation units to prevent their carapaces from cracking in the alien climate. Even General Kraftnog's people, despite their natural resilience, demanded additional cooling systems to prevent overheating in the hostile environment. 3 days later, the landing bay of Admiral Vashi's flagship looked like a military equipment expo had collided with a paranoia convention. Soldiers in full environmental armor checked and rechecked their sealed systems. Emergency medical teams stood by with species-specific treatment protocols. The air hummed with the sound of life support systems running final diagnostics. And then Amy Kowalski walked in. She wore standard-issue combat fatigues, boots that had seen better decades, and the equipment harness that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts and wishful thinking. Her only concession to the hostile environment was a basic rebreather mask hanging around her neck like a fashion accessory she might remember to use later. She was also carrying the same coffee mug. "Is she serious?" Quartermaster whispered to his aide, his neck extending to get a better look at what appeared to be a human death wish in progress. "Maybe it is some kind of advanced camouflage?" Rand suggested hopefully. "Perhaps the simple appearance conceals sophisticated protection technology?" Their speculation was interrupted by the arrival of Brandon Torres, who introduced himself as the human medical officer by immediately tripping over his own equipment bag and scattering medical supplies across the landing bay floor. Sorry, he said, scrambling to collect bandages and medication containers. "I always do that when I am nervous." Which is pretty much constantly, so you will probably want to get used to it. If Amy's appearance had been concerning, Brandon's was downright alarming. His medical kit appeared to consist entirely of basic first aid supplies, a few bottles of what looked suspiciously like alcohol, and a collection of pills that probably came from a pharmacy, rather than a military medical facility. "That is your medical equipment?" Judge Quintera asked, her voice rising several octaves. "Oh, this!" Brandon held up his bag cheerfully. "This is just the basics. Bandages, painkillers, antiseptic, and some really excellent jokes to keep people distracted while I figure out what is wrong with them." He paused, considering. Actually, that last part might not be as reassuring as I intended. Morden, the philosophical species representative, approached Admiral Vashi with visible concern. "Sir, should we not provide the humans with proper equipment? Surely they do not intend to attempt this exercise without environmental protection?" Admiral Vashi watched Amy check her basic gear with the casual efficiency of someone preparing for a grocery run rather than a potentially lethal military operation. "I suspect, my friend, that this is exactly what they intend to do." In the corner of the landing bay, several junior officers from different species had started what appeared to be some kind of numerical exchange system. Quartermaster noticed his aide participating and leaned over to inquire. "They are placing wagers," the aide explained quietly, "on how long the humans survive after planetfall. And the current odds? Most bets are for less than 6 hours. A few optimists are wagering they might last a full day." Admiral Vashi's hearing was excellent, even across species barriers. He turned to Amy, who was now casually chatting with Brandon about something that was making them both laugh. "Engineer Kowalski," he called out, "are you certain you require no additional equipment for this exercise?" Amy looked up from her conversation and grinned. "Admiral, I appreciate the concern, but we humans learned a long time ago that the best equipment in the galaxy is worthless if you do not know how to adapt when it breaks." She hefted her simple gear bag. "Besides, this is not about surviving Mordax 7 in comfort. This is about completing the mission and coming home with a good story to tell." Brandon nodded enthusiastically. "Plus, if we die horribly, at least we will not have wasted a lot of expensive equipment doing it." The landing bay fell silent, except for the hum of environmental systems, and what might have been the sound of Admiral Vashi's confidence in his own species' superiority beginning to crack just a little around the edges. The transport shuttles approached Mordax 7 like a collection of very nervous metal birds descending into what appeared to be the galaxy's least popular vacation destination. Through the viewports, the planet's surface looked exactly as advertised, hostile, unpleasant, and actively trying to kill anything stupid enough to visit. Inside the Zentorian shuttle, Admiral Vashi ran through his pre-landing checklist for the 4th time. Atmospheric seals, check. Emergency oxygen backup, check. Acid-resistant coating on all external equipment, double check. His 8 arms moved in practice coordination, ensuring every piece of safety equipment was functioning at optimal levels. The other species were equally thorough. General Kraftnog's people had modified their cooling systems 3 times during the descent, trying to compensate for the planet's hostile atmospheric conditions. Judge Quintera's insectoid team had sealed themselves into environmental suits that looked more like individual spacecraft than protective gear. Even Moran, whose species evolved on a world where acid rain was considered refreshing, had donned additional protective layers as a precautionary measure. The philosophical Morton had spent the entire descent meditating on the wisdom of this particular exercise, though his meditation was somewhat interrupted by the need to constantly adjust his atmospheric filters. In the human shuttle, Amy Kowalski was reading what appeared to be a technical manual while Brandon Torres practiced what he called his reassuring bedside manner on an increasingly nervous transport pilot. So Brandon was saying cheerfully, "The good news is that if the acid rain dissolves our skin, we probably will not feel it for very long." "That is not reassuring," the pilot replied. "Well, no," Brandon admitted. "But it is technically good news, depending on your perspective." The landing sequence began with the kind of elaborate safety protocols that made orbital mechanics look simple. Each alien shuttle deployed protective barriers, established atmospheric processing fields, and created what amounted to small environmental bubbles around their landing sites. The human shuttle simply landed. Amy and Brandon walked down the ramp like they were stepping off a city bus, pausing only long enough to put on their basic rebreather masks. The planet's atmosphere immediately began trying to kill them, of course, but they seemed more interested in getting their bearings than in acknowledging the hostile environment's attempts at homicide. "Gravity feels heavier," Brandon observed, bouncing slightly on his feet. "Like wearing a backpack full of rocks." 2.3 times Earth normal, Amy confirmed, checking a handheld scanner that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts and optimism. "Not bad. Remember that training exercise on Luna Base where they cranked the artificial gravity to 3 times normal?" "Oh yeah, where you threw up on Commander Peterson's boots." "That was you," Amy corrected. "I just laughed until I passed out." Admiral Vashi watched this casual conversation through his shuttle's external cameras while his environmental systems completed their safety checks. The humans were standing in an atmosphere that could dissolve most metals under gravity that should have been crushing their fragile bone structure, discussing past training exercises like they were reminiscing about a picnic. "Are their atmospheric readings malfunctioning?" he asked his technical officer. "No, sir. Scanners show the same hostile conditions we detected from orbit. Sulfuric compounds, corrosive particulates, toxic atmospheric pressure. The humans should be experiencing severe respiratory distress at minimum." Through the view screen, they could see Amy taking actual notes while Brandon performed what appeared to be jumping jacks, testing his mobility under the increased gravity. That was when the weather decided to make things interesting. The acid rain started as a light drizzle, the kind of gentle precipitation that on most worlds would have been pleasant. On Mordak 7, it was the kind of precipitation that dissolved unprotected metal within minutes. Every alien team immediately activated emergency protocols. Atmospheric shields snapped into place, creating protective domes around their landing sites. Environmental suits sealed themselves automatically, switching to internal life support systems. Emergency medical teams went to high alert, preparing for potential equipment failures and exposure injuries. The humans looked up at the sky like they were checking to see if they needed umbrellas. "Huh," Amy said, as the first drops of acid rain began hitting her uniform. "It tingles." Judge Quintera watched in absolute horror through her helmet's external cameras as the human engineer stood in what was essentially liquid death falling from the sky. The acid rain was already causing her skin to redden slightly, like a mild sunburn, but instead of seeking shelter or activating protective equipment, Amy continued taking readings from her scanner. "This cannot be happening," Judge Quintera whispered to her aide. "They are committing suicide by negligence." "Perhaps they do not understand the danger?" the aide suggested hopefully. That theory was immediately disproven when Brandon called out cheerfully, "Hey Amy, this stuff is starting to make my arms itch. Should we be concerned?" "Nah," Amy replied, wiping a streak of acid rain off her cheek with the back of her hand. "Remember that time we got caught in that chemical storm on Kepler Station?" This is practically bottled water compared to that. Oh, right, where your eyebrows grew back funny for 3 months. They grew back, Amy pointed out reasonably. Norton's philosophical mind was struggling to process what he was witnessing. I do not understand, he broadcast on the general communication channel. How are they not experiencing severe tissue damage? Amy looked up toward the alien shuttles, apparently hearing the transmission through her basic comm unit. You mean this? She gestured at the acid rain that was now falling steadily, creating small wisps of steam where it contacted her exposed skin. Back home we call this Tuesday in Chicago. She continued working on her scanner readings while the rain intensified. Actually, this is pretty mild. The pH is only around 2.5. We used to swim in lakes more acidic than this after industrial runoff. That is impossible, General Kraftnog interjected over the comm. No biological organism can survive direct contact with such corrosive substances. Brandon laughed, the sound carrying clearly through the atmospheric interference. Oh, you should meet Amy's grandmother. That woman used to clean house with chemicals that would dissolve your armor plating. Used them with her bare hands too, claimed rubber gloves were for weaklings. Amy nodded, still taking notes as the acid rain continued to redden her skin. Humans adapt. It is kind of our thing. Our ancestors survived ice ages, plagues, famines, and environmental disasters that would have wiped out most species. A little acid rain is just, well, weather. She looked directly toward Judge Quintara's shuttle, somehow knowing exactly where the horrified insectoid was watching from. Besides, if this stuff was really dangerous, evolution would have given us better sense than to stand around in it. There was a long pause before Brandon added, helpfully of course, evolution also gave us the ability to eat things that are actively trying to poison us, so our risk assessment might be slightly off. Quartermaster A, monitoring the situation from his own protective environment, pulled up biological readings from the human team. Their cellular regeneration is compensating for the acid damage in real time, he reported in disbelief. They are literally healing as fast as the environment is hurting them. Admiral Vashi watched Amy finish her initial survey work, her skin now noticeably reddened but her movements still casual and efficient. She had just spent 20 minutes in conditions that would have killed most species within minutes, and she was treating it like a minor inconvenience. How? He asked, though he was not sure if he was asking his crew or the universe in general. Amy's voice came back over the comm, cheerful despite the fact that she was standing in acid rain that was slowly dissolving her uniform. Simple. We did not evolve to survive in perfect conditions, Admiral. We evolved to survive when everything went wrong. She hefted her equipment pack, now steaming slightly from acid exposure. Shall we get started with this exercise? This weather is actually kind of refreshing once you get used to it. The tactical exercise had been proceeding smoothly for exactly 37 minutes when Mordak 7 decided to remind everyone why it had earned its reputation as a thoroughly unpleasant place to visit. The attack came from underground, which in retrospect made perfect sense given that anything smart enough to evolve on this planet would obviously avoid spending time on the surface. The creatures erupted from the acidic soil like nightmares with a geology degree. Six-legged, roughly the size of small vehicles, covered in natural armor that looked suspiciously like it had evolved specifically to deflect energy weapons. Their heads were mostly mouth, filled with teeth that dripped with the same corrosive substances currently falling from the sky. And they could spit acid with the accuracy of trained marksmen. The first blast of concentrated acid struck General Kraftnog's position, dissolving a section of equipment that had cost more than most planets' annual defense budgets. The molten general immediately activated his heavy energy shields and began deploying what appeared to be enough firepower to level a small city. Hostile contact. All units to defensive positions. Admiral Vashi's voice crackled over the comm as his team's automated defense systems came online. Energy barriers materialized around the alien positions like translucent walls of controlled physics, deflecting acid projectiles and providing cover for the heavy weapons teams. Judge Quintara's insectoid soldiers moved with military precision, establishing overlapping fields of fire while their powered armor systems locked into combat mode. Moran's people deployed energy cannons that hummed with enough power to punch holes through starship hulls. It was an impressive display of galactic military technology in action, coordinated, efficient, and probably overkill for anything short of a planetary invasion. The humans took a different approach. Amy grabbed a piece of broken hull plating that had been corroded by the acid rain, hefted it like a shield, and charged directly at the nearest creature while shouting something that sounded suspiciously like, "Come here, you ugly piece of space garbage." "What is she doing?" Morden asked in horror as Amy used the makeshift shield to deflect an acid blast, then swung it like a club at the creature's legs. Brandon, meanwhile, had noticed that Quartermaster A's aide had been caught in the initial attack and was bleeding profusely from what appeared to be acid burns. Instead of seeking cover, the human medic sprinted across open ground under heavy fire, his first aid kit bouncing wildly as acid projectiles sizzled past his head. "Medic down here," he called out cheerfully, sliding into cover next to the wounded alien like he was stealing home base. "Do not worry, I have seen worse. Granted, most of those people died, but I am feeling optimistic about your chances." The wounded alien stared at Brandon in disbelief as the human began field surgery without any protective equipment, his hands working quickly despite the acid rain that continued to fall on both of them. "You cannot treat my injuries in these conditions," the alien gasped, "the atmospheric contamination alone." "Oh, this is nothing," Brandon replied, cleaning the wound with what appeared to be ordinary water from his canteen. "One time I had to perform an appendectomy in the middle of a chemical weapons attack. That was exciting. This is just Tuesday." Meanwhile, Amy had discovered that the creatures, while heavily armored, had a weakness. Their 6 legs made them stable but not particularly maneuverable, and the acid that made up most of their offensive capabilities was useless against someone who was already soaked in the stuff. She grabbed a broken piece of equipment, jammed it into the ground to create a lever, and used the planet's heavy gravity to her advantage. The improvised catapult launched a chunk of corroded metal directly into the creature's softer underbelly. "Physics," she announced happily as the creature collapsed, "works every time." The second creature learned from its companion's mistake and approached more cautiously, which turned out to be an even worse tactical decision. Amy used the extra time to grab more debris, fashion a crude but effective spear from a bent antenna array, and position herself where the creature would have to expose its flank to attack her. That was when everything went wrong in the most educational way possible. The third creature, apparently smarter than its companions, had flanked around to attack from Amy's blind spot. Its acid blast caught her across the left shoulder and arm, dissolving fabric and burning through skin with a sizzling sound that made every alien present flinch in sympathetic pain. Amy looked down at the injury, which was bleeding freely and showed visible chemical burns, then looked back at the creature with an expression of mild annoyance. "Okay," she said conversationally, "now I am irritated." Instead of retreating or calling for medical assistance, Amy tore a strip of fabric from her uniform, wrapped it around the wound to stop the bleeding, and picked up her improvised spear with her good arm. "Amy," Brandon called from where he was still treating the wounded alien. "How bad is it?" "Flesh wound," she called back, dodging another acid blast. "I will walk it off." Judge Quintero watched through her external cameras as the human female continued fighting while bleeding from injuries that should have incapacitated her. The chemical burns alone should have sent her into shock, but instead Amy was using her wounded arm to stabilize her spear while she maneuvered for another attack. "This is impossible," Judge Quintero whispered. "She should be unconscious from pain." Quartermaster had stopped firing his own weapons and was instead recording everything through his suit's camera systems, necessary for scientific documentation. He explained to his aide, though his voice carried the tone of someone witnessing something that fundamentally challenged his understanding of biology. "The human pain tolerance appears to be orders of magnitude beyond anything in our database," he murmured into his recorder. "Subject continues combat operations despite injuries that would incapacitate most known species. Recommend immediate reclassification of human physical limitations. Amy finished off the third creature by using its own momentum against it, stepping aside at the last moment and letting it impale itself on her makeshift spear. The weapon snapped from the impact, but the creature was thoroughly dead. Anyone else want to play? She asked the remaining creatures, who had apparently decided that attacking the small bleeding human was not the tactical advantage they had initially calculated. The remaining acid spitters retreated underground with what appeared to be the creature equivalent of wounded dignity. Brandon finished bandaging his patient and looked up at the alien defensive positions, where heavily armed soldiers were still maintaining full combat readiness behind energy shields and powered armor. "All clear," he announced, "though I recommend we keep moving. Those things are probably regrouping, and they seem to learn from their mistakes." Amy walked over, her improvised bandage already soaked with blood but her movements still steady and purposeful. "How is our patient?" she asked. "He will live," Brandon replied, "though he keeps asking how we are not dead yet." "Reasonable question," Amy admitted, looking at her acid-burned, bleeding arm with the kind of clinical interest most people reserved for mildly interesting weather patterns. "I suppose the answer is that we are too stubborn to die properly." Admiral Vashi's voice came over the comm, carefully controlled but carrying an undertone of something that might have been awe. "Human team, please report your status." Amy looked up at his defensive position, where enough military firepower to stop a small army was still deployed against creatures that two humans had just defeated with improvised weapons and what appeared to be spite. "2 humans, operational and ready to continue," she reported. "Though I could use a fresh cup of coffee when we get back to the ship." The seismic event that drove them underground came without warning, which seemed to be Mordax 7's preferred method of introducing new complications. One moment they were regrouping after the creature attack. The next moment the ground was performing what could charitably be described as an interpretive dance routine about geological instability. "Cave system, 200 meters northeast." Admiral Vashi shouted over the rumbling as fissures began opening across the landscape. "Emergency shelter protocols." The underground cavern they found was vast, ancient, and filled with an atmosphere that made the surface conditions look positively pleasant by comparison. The air was thick with mineral particles that interfered with electronic systems, and strange crystalline formations jutted from the walls like nature's attempt at modern art. Within minutes of entering the cave, every alien environmental suit began malfunctioning, atmospheric processors failing. Judge Quintera announced, her voice distorted by static as her suit's communication systems struggled with the interference. "Unknown mineral compounds are clogging the filtration systems." General Kraftnog's cooling systems began overheating almost immediately. "Emergency shutdown on all non-essential systems," he reported grimly. "At this rate, I have maybe an hour before thermal failure." Moran's breathing apparatus started making sounds that definitely were not part of its normal operational parameters. A series of clicks, wheezes, and what sounded suspiciously like mechanical death rattles echoed from his helmet. "This is suboptimal," Morton observed philosophically, though his own suit indicators were flashing warnings in colors that probably meant very bad things. Amy and Brandon, who had no environmental suits to malfunction, looked around the cave with the kind of professional interest that suggested they were mentally cataloging exit routes and potential resources rather than panicking about imminent equipment failure. "Well," Amy said, breathing the mineral-rich air without apparent difficulty, "this is cozy." "Definitely has character," Brandon agreed, his voice slightly nasal from the atmospheric conditions but otherwise normal. "Reminds me of that cave system on Europa Station, except with better lighting." Amy walked over to where Moran was struggling with his malfunctioning breathing apparatus, which was now making sounds like a coffee machine having an existential crisis. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward his helmet. "You cannot repair our technology," Moran protested, though his voice was becoming increasingly strained. "The mineral interference requires specialized equipment that—" "Humor me," Amy interrupted, already examining the suit's external systems with the kind of focused attention that suggested she understood exactly what was wrong. 5 minutes later, she had jury-rigged a solution using parts cannibalized from her own equipment, a piece of the cave wall that had useful filtering properties, and what appeared to be a spare coffee filter from Brandon's medical kit. "Try that," she said, stepping back as Moran's breathing apparatus settled into a steady, normal rhythm. "How?" Moran asked in amazement. "The atmospheric interference should have made repairs impossible without clean room conditions." Amy shrugged, already moving to help General Kraftnog with his overheating cooling system. "Humans do not really do clean room conditions. We learned to fix things in the field because most of the time, the field was actively trying to kill us." She began explaining while she worked, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she rerouted cooling lines and bypassed damaged systems. "See, our planet had this habit of changing the rules without warning. Ice ages that lasted thousands of years, plagues that wiped out entire continents, volcanic eruptions that blocked out the sun for decades. Every few generations, something would happen that required our ancestors to completely rethink how to survive." Brandon was helping Judge Quintera with her suit's filtration system, cheerfully chatting while he worked. "Amy is being modest. Humans did not just survive environmental disasters, we thrived on them. Every catastrophe made us better at adapting to the next one." "But how?" Morden asked, his philosophical mind struggling to understand the practical implications. "Surely such constant upheaval would prevent the development of stable civilization." Amy laughed, the sound echoing strangely in the mineral-rich atmosphere. "That is where you are thinking about it wrong. We did not develop stable civilization despite the chaos. We developed adaptable civilization because of it." She finished General Kraftnog's repairs and moved on to help Quartermaster A, whose suit was having creative failures in systems that were not even supposed to be connected. "Every human culture independently figured out the same basic truth," she continued. "When you cannot control your environment, you learn to change yourself. When the climate shifts, you develop new technologies. When diseases emerge, you develop medicine. When resources run out, you find new ones. Or move somewhere else," Brandon added helpfully. "Humans are excellent at moving somewhere else when things get too uncomfortable. Though our definition of too uncomfortable might be a bit different from yours." Morden watched Amy repair complex alien technology using improvised tools and apparent intuition. "You speak of adaptation as though it were a conscious choice rather than an evolutionary process." "Well, it sort of is both," Amy explained, her hands deep in Quartermaster A's suit systems. "Evolution gave us the basic toolkit, but we learned to use it consciously. Humans do not just adapt to new environments, we engineer our own adaptation. Take Brandon here," she gestured toward the medic, who was now somehow simultaneously treating 3 different alien equipment malfunctions and making jokes about mineral poisoning. "Medical training teaches you to work with whatever tools and conditions you have available. You cannot always wait for perfect conditions to save someone's life." Brandon nodded enthusiastically. "Humans are basically biological Swiss Army knives. We have tools for situations we have never encountered, backup systems for our backup systems, and an annoying tendency to treat impossible problems as interesting puzzles." General Kraftnog's suit systems came back online with a satisfied hum. "Your species evolved redundancy as a survival trait. More like we evolved stubbornness," Amy corrected. "When faced with a problem that should kill us, humans have 2 responses: solve it or refuse to die until we figure out how to solve it." She stepped back from Quartermaster A's now functioning equipment and looked around the cave at the various alien species whose lives she and Brandon had just saved using spare parts and what amounted to educated guessing. "Plus," she added with a grin, "we really hate admitting defeat. It is a pride thing." Morden's suit system stabilized as Brandon finished his repairs, and the philosophical alien stood in the mineral-rich atmosphere of an alien cave, breathing normally thanks to human ingenuity applied to technology they had never seen before. "I am beginning to understand," he said slowly, "why your species does not require armor. You do not protect yourselves from hostile environments. You simply refuse to acknowledge that any environment is truly hostile." Amy's grin widened. "Now you are getting it." Outside the cave, the seismic activity was beginning to subside, but none of the aliens seemed particularly eager to leave their improvised shelter. For the first time since landing on Mordax 7, they were beginning to realize that perhaps the humans were not insane. Perhaps they were something far more dangerous, competent. The emergency evacuation call came just as everyone was starting to feel comfortable in their underground shelter, which seemed to be Mordax 7's way of reminding them that the planet had not finished trying to kill them yet. Admiral Vashi's voice crackled over the communication system with the kind of carefully controlled panic that indicated very bad news delivered by someone trying not to cause additional panic. All teams, immediate evacuation required. Plasma storm approaching. Estimated arrival in 3 hours. Transport shuttles have sustained damage during the seismic event. The technical details that followed painted a picture that was both complicated and deeply unpleasant. The transport ship's external power coupling systems had been damaged by falling debris, and the repairs required someone to work outside the ships during what was essentially a controlled nuclear explosion happening in the atmosphere above them. The plasma storm will generate radiation levels approximately 10,000 times normal background, Admiral Drohorn explained, his military strategist mind already calculating impossible odds. Even our most advanced environmental suits cannot provide adequate protection for the duration required to complete repairs. Judge Quintara's mandibles clicked nervously. How long would the external repairs take? A minimum 2 hours, Quartermaster reported grimly. And that assumes optimal working conditions, which we definitely do not have. General Kraft-Nog's internal temperature fluctuated with what appeared to be stress. So we are trapped here until the storm passes? Negative, Admiral Drohorn replied. Long-range sensors indicate this storm system is part of a planetary weather pattern. The next clear window for evacuation is not for 6 standard months. The cave fell silent except for the hum of various life support systems and what might have been the sound of several different species contemplating their own mortality. Amy stood up, dusting mineral particles off her already acid-stained uniform. Well, she said cheerfully, I guess I should get to work then. The immediate response was a chorus of alien voices all saying variations of absolutely not in their respective languages, which created a sound like a very multilingual argument between confused wildlife. Engineer Kowalski, Admiral Vashi said firmly, you cannot survive in those conditions any more than the rest of us. The radiation exposure alone will probably give me a really interesting tan, Amy interrupted, already checking her basic toolkit. Look, I appreciate the concern, but this is pretty straightforward. Someone needs to go outside and fix the ships so we can all go home. I am the only one here who can work without environmental protection. Admiral Drohorn watched through his suit's external cameras as the human female prepared for what amounted to a suicide mission with the same casual efficiency she had shown throughout the entire exercise. His military mind, trained to calculate tactical advantages and strategic possibilities, was beginning to process something that fundamentally changed his understanding of warfare. Humans, he realized, did not have superior technology or overwhelming firepower. What they had was the ability to operate in conditions that would kill everyone else. They could go places, do things, and survive situations that were simply impossible for other species. That was not just a tactical advantage. That was a strategic revolution. The radiation will cook your cellular structure, Morden protested, his philosophical nature struggling with the concept of willing self-sacrifice. Probably, Amy agreed. But human cellular regeneration is pretty robust, and I heal fast. Besides, someone has to do it, and I am the only volunteer. She paused at the cave entrance, looking back at the collection of heavily armored, environmentally protected alien warriors who had just realized that their most advanced survival technology was inferior to one small human female with a toolkit and what appeared to be a complete disregard for personal safety. Try not to worry too much, she said. I have done stupider things and survived. When? Brandon asked, though he was already preparing medical supplies for what was obviously going to be a very unpleasant patient. Last Tuesday, Amy replied, and walked out into the plasma storm. For the next 2 hours, Admiral Drohorn monitored Amy's progress through long-range sensors, watching a single human figure working methodically on the transport ships while the planet's atmosphere tried to murder her with concentrated radiation. She moved slowly but steadily, taking breaks only when the radiation levels spiked beyond what even human endurance could tolerate. His tactical computer kept calculating her survival odds, and the numbers kept getting worse. After 1 hour, the radiation exposure should have incapacitated her. After 90 minutes, she should have been unconscious. After 2 hours, she should have been dead. Instead, she completed the repairs and walked back into the cave under her own power. Amy's skin was burned red and peeling. Her hair had taken on an interesting metallic sheen from radiation exposure, and she was moving with the careful precision of someone whose nervous system was not entirely convinced it was still connected to her body. "All done," she announced, sitting down heavily on a convenient rock. "Ships are ready for takeoff whenever you are." Brandon immediately began medical scans, his face growing increasingly concerned as the readings displayed. "Amy, your radiation exposure levels are, well, they are what I would technically classify as completely insane." "How insane?" "You should be dead insane. You should have been dead an hour ago insane." Amy nodded thoughtfully. "Feels about right. I can taste colors and my left foot has gone completely numb, so that is probably the radiation poisoning." She looked around at the assembled alien warriors, all of whom were staring at her like she had just performed a magic trick that violated several laws of physics. "Shall we get out of here?" she asked. "I could really use that coffee now." The medical bay aboard Admiral Vashi's flagship had seen its share of unusual patients over the years, but nothing quite like Amy Kowalski lying on a treatment table while casually discussing mission logistics with Commander Molly. Her skin was still peeling from radiation burns, her cellular regeneration readings were fluctuating wildly, and she was supposed to be unconscious from the pain medication that Brandon had administered. Instead, she was reviewing tactical reports on a handheld tablet. "The power coupling repairs should hold for at least 6 months, she was saying, apparently oblivious to the fact that alien medical technicians were staring at her vital signs in complete bewilderment. "Though I recommend installing backup systems before the next planetary assault. Those plasma storms are murder on external equipment." Dr. Zephyrian, the ship's chief medical officer, approached Admiral Vashi with the kind of expression reserved for delivering news that challenged fundamental assumptions about biology. "Admiral," the doctor said quietly, "her cellular regeneration rate is increasing. Not just healing, but actively improving. The radiation damage that should have taken months to repair is disappearing in real time." Through the medical bay's observation window, they could see Amy sitting up despite having enough radiation poisoning to kill most species 3 times over, cheerfully arguing with Brandon about the optimal placement of emergency medical supplies for hostile environment operations. "This is medically impossible," Dr. Zephyrian continued. "No known species can survive that level of radiation exposure, much less recover from it while remaining conscious and alert." A quartermaster was taking detailed notes, his scientific mind struggling to process what he was witnessing. "She completed a 2-hour repair operation in conditions that our computers calculated as having a 0% survival rate. 0%. Our models did not even consider survival as a variable." Judge Quintara approached the observation window, her insectoid eyes studying Amy with the fascination of someone observing a biological impossibility. "How is she still functional? The pain alone should have rendered her unconscious." "Oh, that," Brandon said, overhearing the conversation while checking Amy's readings. "Humans have this thing where we just sort of ignore pain when we have work to do. It is not that we do not feel it, we just file it under deal with later and keep going. That cannot be healthy," Morton observed. "Definitely not," Amy agreed cheerfully from her treatment table. "But it is effective. Besides, pain is just your body's way of telling you that something is wrong. Since I already knew something was wrong, the pain was basically redundant information." The formal council meeting that followed was unlike any in Galactic Defense history. For the first time, Admiral Vashi found himself offering an official apology to a species whose military capabilities he had underestimated. The Galactic Defense Council formally acknowledges that human military methods, while unconventional, have proven remarkably effective, he announced to the assembled representatives. We withdraw our previous recommendations regarding mandatory armor and protective equipment for human personnel. General Kraftnog's molten skin had cooled to what appeared to be a thoughtful temperature. Engineer Kowalski, your species' approach to hostile environment operations challenges everything we thought we understood about battlefield survival. Amy, who had insisted on attending the meeting despite being technically still under medical observation, raised her coffee mug in acknowledgement. Thank you, General. Though I should point out that what you call hostile environment operations, we just call Tuesday. Admiral Vashi studied the small human female who had just survived conditions that should have been impossible to endure, completed repairs that should have been impossible to finish, and was now planning their next mission while recovering from injuries that should have been impossible to survive. I believe I understand now, he said slowly. Other species developed armor and protective equipment because we needed protection from hostile environments. Humans do not need armor because you are the armor. Your bodies, your minds, your entire species evolved to be the protective equipment. Plus, Brandon added helpfully, we are way too stubborn to die properly. Death keeps trying to claim us, but we file the paperwork incorrectly and show up to work the next day anyway. The council members exchanged glances that carried the weight of strategic implications. They had spent centuries developing technology to protect their warriors from hostile environments, when the solution had been right there all along, and recruit the species that had evolved to be naturally protected. 24 hours later, Amy Kowalski walked into the engineering department carrying the same coffee mug, wearing a fresh uniform that hid new scars, and reviewing preliminary reports for their next mission assignment. Her radiation exposure readings were still technically in the should-be hospitalized range, but she had convinced Dr. Zephyrian that bed rest was incompatible with her psychological well-being. Quartermaster watched her settle into her workstation and begin reviewing technical specifications for equipment modifications, with her movements showing no sign of the ordeal she had survived less than 2 days earlier. Fascinating, he murmured to his aide. I initially assumed humans were fearless. But that assessment was incorrect. Sir? Quartermaster continued observing Amy as she casually discussed atmospheric pressure requirements for their next planetary operation, treating near-death experiences like routine maintenance issues. Humans are not fearless, he said thoughtfully. Fearless implies the absence of concern for danger. Humans clearly understand danger, they simply refuse to let it stop them from accomplishing their objectives. He made a note in his scientific log, documenting what would become one of the most important strategic assessments in galactic defense history. They are not fearless, he repeated. They are something far more dangerous than that. They are adaptable. Amy looked up from her work, caught his eye through the observation window, and raised her coffee mug in a casual salute. Despite everything she had been through, despite the scars and the radiation exposure and the near-death experience, she was grinning. It was, Quartermaster realized, the grin of someone who had just figured out how to make the impossible look routine. And that, he understood with a mixture of admiration and mild terror, was exactly what made humans so dangerous.